Welcome to the Wild Side. That was Sarah McLaughlin with Building a Mystery. And this is your host, Kight. And today I would like to talk about a concept that was discussed by a scientist and an architect and an engineer named Rachel Armstrong on a somewhat recent TED Talk. And she also turned this idea into a really short book that you can buy on Amazon, all about the things that she was discussing in her talk. So it's kind of like basically a written version of the TED Talk, which is really nice because I'm not always a fan of watching videos on the internet, but I do like to read. And so I was able to hear about all these ideas that she has, which are really interesting and really unusual. And her area of expertise is something that kind of brings together sustainability and energy use and conservation and architecture and kind of landscaping and all this stuff, and into this whole idea of living architecture, which is basically an emerging field. It's not really, kind of full grown just yet because it's a lot of really brand new, kind of unusual out there ideas that are just being generated. But it is more than a field. It's also kind of this concept and this belief and also practice. And all these things are associated with the idea that our buildings can function in the same way that living systems function. And that also collections of buildings, so whole communities and towns, can also function in this way, just like we have cells that work together to form organs, and organs that work together to, have processes in our body go as planned. Well, that's basically the idea here, is that there are all these different levels, and all these different things can be tied together in a very living sort of way, a very organic way. And that would potentially help these structures and these collections of structures to become more a part of their habitat and less of a burden on the ecosystem, and maybe more functional and more useful to us than the ones that we're using today. So as I said, this was written about in this TED-sponsored essay and book, and also discussed online. And it kind of starts off by thinking about all of the events that surrounded the 2011 Japanese tsunami, and thinking about how this is kind of a case that exemplifies the shortcomings of our structures and the ways that we could move forward, the ways that our lives could change and the world would be different if we had these sorts of living architecture techniques and structures in place. So, for example, during the tsunami, which of course was first an earthquake and then a tidal wave, the buildings crumbled, the power grid failed, the roads split apart, there was a bunch of debris and detritus that was washed up from the shoreline up to 5 kilometers inland. There was toxic waste everywhere, including things that were quite dangerous, like sewage and radioactive stuff from the power plant. Ecosystems were contaminated by those sorts of chemicals, but also other things that were just in the environment and were suddenly carried to places where they shouldn't have been. Economic livelihoods were destroyed. So, for example, farmers lost their livestock and their agricultural fields and things like that. And people, of course, were killed and harmed, and that was both directly when everything hit, but also indirectly, so afterwards when they had a lack of water and a lack of food and a lack of hygiene. And then also there was this massive restoration effort that's still ongoing, and it includes dealing with tons and tons of waste and rebuilding thousands of structures, cleaning up the environment, moving people back to their homes. And all of this is extremely extensive and intensive, and it requires a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money. And one of the amazing things about this was that it all occurred despite the fact that Japan has early warning sensors on the ocean floor. It uses building techniques that help the structures withstand the earthquakes. So they kind of have these movable bases where they're able to shift a little bit as the earth moves, and therefore not necessarily put as much stress on the building materials. They also have rapid response strategies over there and extremely good communication. And despite all of these things that they put in place to deal with something like an earthquake, they weren't ready for the tsunami, because it wasn't just an earthquake, it was lots of different things that happened all together. And that scenario that they actually faced was more than what they could handle. And this really highlights the fact that we can never be fully prepared for what nature brings. And as a result of that, the structures that we build can also never be fully prepared, which means that there are always going to be these surprise occurrences that can cause a lot of danger and a lot of injury because they aren't ready to withstand what's out there. And this also highlights the fact that there's kind of a gap between what we do now and what we could do in the future, because obviously there is some room here for improvement, and maybe if we think outside the box, we can potentially come up with some solutions to these issues so that if such a thing were to happen again, all of these things wouldn't be problems at all, or maybe they would just be lesser problems, and so something we could handle much more easily. So this is why living architecture is such an attractive idea, because it's an idea that we could change our building style so that our structures and our communities would be better able to respond to nature in the same way that living organisms respond to nature. So whether that's because they're anticipating what's coming, or because they react better to it when it arrives, or because they have some sort of kind of robustness built in so that they're more resilient, whatever the case might be, there is this ability of natural organisms to often respond to challenges that come externally to them. And so hopefully, if we kind of think about these techniques, we might find a way to incorporate that in our own buildings. Now, I should take a moment here to say that basically what I'm doing here in today's show is I'm going to walk you through a lot of the major points of the book, and I'm doing it actually in the same way that the author has laid it out. And even though I have selected out, the main ideas that she wanted to emphasize, I'm not by any means talking about everything, so you should definitely follow this up if you're a bit more interested and read the author's own words, because you're going to get a lot more detail than what I've got here. And obviously I'm not an expert in this, I just thought it was a really interesting and unusual idea, and so I was intrigued and I wanted to read about it. But she is actually the expert, and so her explanations are much more lucid than mine, most likely. But in any case, the next thing that I wanted to talk about, the next thing that she brought up, was kind of the dichotomy between current architecture and the potential architecture of the future. And to think about this, you kind of have to think about what techniques we use and what our mindset is when it comes to building things. So basically what she was saying is that we design and construct most buildings in exactly the same way. So we have a certain set of materials that we use, we have a certain kind of industrial process that we tend to use, or multiple different processes that we're always employing time and again. And this creates a bunch of structures that are similarly unresponsive to the environment. And that's because they're made of things like steel and concrete and other kind of static materials that basically once we put them up, they just sit there and hold their shape, and that's all they do. They can't react if there is a different level of sunlight or a different amount of water or whatever the case might be. They just are as they are. And on top of this, another real problem with our current method of construction is that a lot of these buildings can damage the environment. And this is both in the process of gathering the structures to create these buildings, but also the buildings themselves. Once we put them up and once they sit there, they are responsible for a huge amount of our carbon dioxide emissions each year, so something like 40%. They can create runoff, they can compact the soil, there might be some chemicals that leach from them. There are all sorts of things that the buildings do that are not good for the environment. But this doesn't have to be the case, so it's possible that we might be able to make structures that are more alive, if you like. So they're able to adapt to environmental fluctuations. And we actually do see this in a lot of buildings today. So for example, on campus, we have something called the ESI. And the ESI was designed to be extremely green and extremely sustainable. And it has some of the sorts of features that she's talking about, although I think that the author here wants to go even further and get some stuff that's even more kind of space-agey. But things like when the sun comes out, then you might have some window features that automatically shut so that you don't get blinded while you're inside. Or they take advantage of extremely warm temperatures and kind of open up in order to let the heat in when they can, or to let some more ventilation happen, or to maybe things are open at certain times of day and closed at other times of day in terms of vents or windows. So there are things like this where we do have features that automatically respond to external conditions. But I think that there are lots of external conditions that could be still built into the sensor. So we haven't actually targeted everything yet. So she's thinking about temperatures, moisture levels, wind levels, events like earthquakes and floods and snow and ice and sunlight. So not just one or two of these things, but all of these things. So better able to completely pay attention to what's happening out there in the environment, no matter what it is, and then responding to that. So basically what she's describing here is things that are acting like little organisms or little organic communities. And many of these, as I said before, show a lot of flexibility and robustness when they're responding to nature, and so that can help them survive when conditions get a bit intense. So in this tsunami example, the buildings were able to respond to the earthquake, as they were designed to do, but then they could not adjust their behavior and respond appropriately to the flooding that came right after. So her idea, what the author is saying, is that we could maybe change the nature of buildings in order to make that sort of multi-part response possible. So even though those are two completely different things, the very same building would be able to notice what is happening and adjust accordingly. Welcome back to The Wild Side. That was Carrie Ann Hurst and Michael Trent with Build Around Your Heart a Wall. And on today's show, I am talking about some ideas that were written about in a short book and also discussed in a TED Talk by an architect known as Rachel Armstrong. And I'm kind of walking you through the book that she wrote, which I recently read on my Kindle, where it was luckily on sale, and it might still be on sale, so you should check it out because it's quite a short little thing, but very interesting. And she's interested in living architecture, so potentially creating buildings that function like little organisms and potentially can take an active role in caring for us and keeping us safe. And kind of the things that she was describing sounded a little bit Star Trek-y, definitely space-agey and very futuristic, where you've basically got these buildings that are almost thinking on their feet and interacting with their inhabitants and taking care of them and communicating with them. And we might not yet be there. We don't have the AI that would be needed to achieve that sort of thing. But we certainly can work to make our buildings more lifelike and make them more kind of aware of the environment. And to do this would involve changing basically our whole philosophy of machines, according to the author. So currently, she says, we take a Cartesian view, wherein basically you've got that hardware body and a software mind, and the two of these work together to achieve a task. And the better the connection between the two things, the smarter a machine is, and the more likely it's able to respond on the fly to novel stimuli and novel situations. So the bodies tend to be made of really tough materials that can last a long time, but because they're tough and because they're built for all this, kind of weathering of the elements, they are often relatively insensitive, and therefore they're not able to provide as much information to the mind of the machine. And the mind is pre-programmed to respond to data using a series of rules. So this is what any basic computer would do. A programmer says, if you get this data, then you respond in this way, and if you get this data, you respond in this way. And you can do quite a lot of those kind of if-then calculations, and you can make those really complex so that you allow something to kind of basically learn, but you're still only going to be able to program in as much as you yourself can think about as a programmer and kind of predict ahead of time and think to put into that computer. It's very hard to come up with algorithms that allow as much flexibility as the human mind has. Now there are some that do have quite a lot of flexibility, so I'm not saying we aren't kind of there yet, but that still needs a lot of development, and so we still have this limited capacity with our machines to really respond to all the full range of things that are happening in the environment, because it's just way too much for us to program into them. So this means that machines and the buildings that are created by machines and the buildings that incorporate machines are going to be limited by our ability to create the kind of computational facility that we really want in these sorts of structures. And on top of this, in order to create these sorts of things, we would have to use massive amounts of materials that are often brought in from elsewhere, and they require mining and consumption of fossil fuel and all sorts of other things that are quite hard on the environment. So these supercomputers, they might be on the horizon, but we might have to sacrifice certain goals that are kind of, towards sustainability and energy consumption in order to get these sorts of things. So this sounds like maybe this sort of thing is not going to be possible, this sort of living architecture. However, what the author says is that there are plenty of things that we can use as inspiration or even as partners for materials. So we don't have to just think about these kind of traditional computer systems that we always tend to use. why don't we think a little bit more naturally and think about some other stuff that we see out there in nature, that we see out there in the habitat that we can emulate instead of computers. And one thing that's nice about this is that these systems that we do see out in nature tend to be more complex, and that makes them harder to understand fully, but it also makes them potentially more resistant to external pressures. And there is indeed some precedent for connecting buildings to the environment, or helping buildings to look more like the environment, and even incorporating or using living things to make useful structures for humans. So there is some possibility that we could take some ideas that are already in play and then kind of expand on these. So for example, people in India often will take fig trees and kind of weave them together and stretch them across a bit of a canyon in order to create a living bridge. And living bridges can take up to 15 years to grow into place, but then can sustain for quite a long time, take quite a lot of weight, and be extremely useful to people. And because they are in fact, native creatures of that habitat, they're able to withstand the weather quite well, and they wouldn't fall apart in the way that a man-made bridge would after several years. And that kind of thing obviously requires quite a lot of forethought, quite a lot of investment, and yet, it has been done and it works quite well. Another example, something that I recently saw when I was in Kenya, a lot of people use cacti and other kind of pokey euphorbia type plants in order to create living fences, and this keeps predators away from their livestock, and it keeps other trespassers off their property. And again, something like that takes a little forethought. You have to think, I'm going to plant all these in this pattern, and eventually after 10, 20 years, they're going to be big enough to really be effective. Another example that's a bit different is Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, who's an architect in the U.S., and he built a lot of really well-known structures, and this maybe is one of the most famous. And it's built atop and also around a running stream and a waterfall. So rather than divert the stream or rather than put the house elsewhere, the people he was building it for really wanted the house right there, and so he just found a way to make that building work with the natural habitat. And all of these are examples of, kind of the natural world and the architectural world working together rather than being two separate entities. But it's not always clear how modern architects can achieve these sorts of things when they're building in the middle of areas that already have a whole lot of disruption and a lot of anthropogenic disturbance. So in places where you've already got a lot of natural species removed, or where the natural habitat has really been altered and no longer looks the same, it's kind of hard to think, right, what should we be emulating? What are the species that do well here? What are the organizations and structures that do well here? And the author says that this is actually something that still can be overcome. It's just that we do have to kind of overlook and look past these sorts of areas where we have already done the most, I don't want to say damage because that does sound judgmental, but we have made the most changes, and so it might not be quite as easy to see how we need to structure things to really fit in with that habitat. But she says, there are lots of ideas already that are out there for how we can make urban environments still, living. So one really good success story is the concept of living walls. And these were first designed by Patrick Blanc, who was a French designer, and he incorporated about 15,000 different plants into the walls of the Musée du Quai Branly, which is in Paris. And these have since sprung up all over the place. So for example, a few years ago I went to Perth in Australia, and I found a building there that had a bunch of these. And you do find them all over the place, actually even here in Falmouth. So for another example on the campus, we have several buildings that have structures that allow plants to grow up the sides and also on the top. So there are, commonly seen features like this where they are incorporating these sorts of natural components and also these natural habitats and structures in order to change things like water flow, temperature of the building, lighting in the building, air quality of the whole area. So all these things have really beneficial effects for the occupants, as well as kind of helping the buildings fit in a bit better to the environment and potentially buffering them from the effects of what's going on outside. Another method that's commonly used is to kind of engage in biomimicry, so to create, for example, a network of offices within a building that are kind of all shaped like the little cells in a beehive, so you can pack as many in as possible, but make flow from one to the other, easier and more attractive. So little things like that where you can kind of see what's happening out in nature and then use that to come up with a solution for a problem that you've got in an architectural setting. Now, one drawback of these examples, and also similar cases, is that they don't necessarily change construction patterns or the actual functioning of the materials that are utilized in the building. They're just kind of making the buildings look a bit better and act a bit better in a particular habitat. But if you want to change the way people are actually beginning to put these buildings together and the way that these buildings are then having an impact kind of on the long term, then you have to go a bit deeper and actually start a bit further back in the process of coming up with all these plans. And the author points out that one of the fundamental concepts of living architecture is that not only can you make buildings a bit more like nature, but you actually can create them more from nature. So I'm not just talking about using wood because of instead of cement because it's a bit more natural, but doing something even more out there than that. So actually harvesting or creating even biological materials that can be used for building. So something more along the lines of those fig trees being used as a bridge. So you could use them as a whole. You could use them to make a whole building. You could use them to make a portion of a building, and they would function like living organisms because they are living organisms, and so therefore they would make the whole structure function more in that way as well. And this could completely change how we actually go about constructing things, because it would make them potentially less planned and more organic. And again, the author does have an example of this, and it's not exactly, it's maybe not the best example because it doesn't involve something organic, but I think that's because this hasn't really been done yet. This is very much still in the theoretical stage. And her example is from Spain, actually. So Antoni Gaudí, who made the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, he had a technique of suspending clay and hanging baskets, and so he would have this wet clay that was hanging up above, and it would drip down, and the weight of gravity would pull it down, and it would land and then kind of mound up after a while and then finally dry in that position. And then the final position was something that was completely chosen by chance, by gravity, as it pulled down little bits of the clay and not others. And then that was his final form. So basically he allowed matter to take a form rather than taking his idea of a form and imposing that on matter and shaping the matter into that shape. So it's basically doing the reverse of what we tend to do when we're putting buildings together. So the author is wondering whether this is something that we can do on the scale of entire buildings. And if we can do that, how in the world would we even go about starting it? Welcome back to The Wild Side. That was Florence and the Machine with My Boy Builds Coffins, and I'm your host, Caitlin Kight. And today I am talking about living architecture, which is an idea of an architect and kind of visionary named Rachel Armstrong. And she has given a talk about this in a TED video that you can find online. And she's also written it up in a very, very short book that I was able to download on my Kindle thanks to a brief sale that might still be going on, so it's definitely worth checking out. And just before the break, I was asking the question of whether we can kind of reverse our ideas of how construction should be done on a building. And rather than having an idea of a form that we want to create and then taking materials in order to put them into that form, can we instead have materials and allow them to take whatever form that they want and then utilize them once they take that shape? And basically what the author is talking about while posing this question is whether we can use synthetic biology to create novel construction materials. At least this is one element of that larger question. So what is synthetic biology? Well, it seeks to shape the development of whole systems or engineer brand new systems from scratch so that they have useful biological properties and are either living or are very lifelike. So you can do this in a couple of different ways. You might modify organisms by manipulating their environment. So this is the sort of thing we do when we're gardening. So for example, when we're changing the amount of light or water that a plant gets. And you can also modify organisms directly. So again, we do this in gardening and also in landscaping when we are pruning, or maybe when we burn something down, because we know that it will grow up differently when it comes back. We also do it when we manipulate genes through breeding or through chemical treatment. So you can do this kind of at all different levels of the landscape and of an organism. It's not just kind of a broad thing. You can do it cellularly, but you can also do it whole organism style. So if we were to do this sort of thing, what kind of products might we expect to create? Well, one example that the author gives is kind of a leathery type of skin that can be used to create walls and other barriers, and which would naturally degrade after some period of time. So in a sense, this, I guess, is quite similar to the sort of material that might have been used to make a teepee, for example. So you kind of would have a frame that you could stretch the hide around, and you would use it for a number of years, and then eventually it would kind of fall apart, but it would be biodegradable, so you could then just discard it and come up with another one. She also writes a lot about something called protocells, and these are self-assembling chemical systems that don't have DNA, so they're not actually cells per se. They're not, living organisms in any sense, but they otherwise do act very similar to cells. So you can make them so they're sensitive to stimuli, they can generate microstructures, they can deliver chemicals, and they can even do this to a chosen destination. They can communicate with each other and kind of organize themselves and coordinate behaviors. And so if these are part of the exteriors of buildings, then they could be able to sense changes in things like humidity or light, and therefore, for example, produce a chemical or migrate to a new location in order to protect the structure or take advantage of those resources and maybe harvest those things and put them into the building so the building could do something with them. So for example, if you want to harvest fresh air that you could pump through the building, if you want to gather water that you could then use for the toilet system, things like this where you've got these little cells working for you to do that sort of thing. The author also gives the example of how these things could harvest carbon dioxide as it's produced by all the things that are happening in the building. And I did say earlier that buildings are responsible for about 40% of our carbon dioxide output. So if we could have little structures that are just sitting there waiting to suck all that up and then do something with them, that would be fantastic, because carbon, of course, is quite a bad thing to be pumping into the atmosphere. Likewise, they could grab other toxins as well and prevent them from accumulating in the air or on the building, and these little things could break down those toxins into less harmful forms, or maybe even useful forms. And what I found really interesting about all of this is that I kind of recently read a book by an author known as China Mieville, and he had a book called Embassy Town, which is what I just read this past summer. And a lot of his stuff is very unusual. It's kind of futuristic, it's extremely inventive, and it's got a lot of imagination. And in this last book, he does talk about pretty much exactly the same thing, where you've got these living buildings that are grown up from these little kind of protocell type bits, and they are basically creatures that you have to have little shepherds taking care of, and they create the buildings, they create the machinery that these cultures, these people in the books are using in their daily lives. So basically all of their little, what we have as computers and vacuum cleaners and all that kind of stuff would be these little creatures that are just biologically able to do these sorts of functions. So it's really unusual to read about people actually thinking about introducing this very same stuff from a fantasy tale into our daily lives. So we really are kind of living in the future where people are thinking about how we can do this for real. And indeed, some of these things are actually just beginning to be created in small amounts in a laboratory setting. And the next step will be to scale them up and see if we can actually apply them, should we want to do so. So the next phase of the author's book is thinking about what would it actually be like if we did that. How would it be to experience this living architecture in real life? And the author lists several examples of art installations, oddly enough, that can be thought of as kind of living architecture. And right now, a lot of these techniques are being considered and employed, but mostly by people who are kind of interested in thinking about them from a philosophical perspective and also an experiential perspective. So they're not necessarily thinking about being practical and actually, constructing a building, doing something to solve that problem of what do we do if there's an earthquake and a tsunami. But it is still kind of, it's being introduced little by little, this thought of using these natural type buildings in our daily lives. So for example, you've got artists that are creating spaces with these kind of biological materials, and the spaces can remember occupants because there are interactions between the people who go through these exhibits and those living materials, and then that is kind of, those interactions generate something that's made permanent, and that's a part of the space then. So that basically that a bit of that person that walked through is always going to be there forever. And so it's kind of an interesting concept of what happens between you and the environment that you're in. There are also other displays that try to connect people to their environment and make them more aware of the habitat and the organisms and how all of it's functioning. So a lot of this is meant to make people think about these ideas and to ponder the connection between, our structures and ourselves. And the next step, of course, will be to ask people, do you actually want to do this stuff in a practical way? So maybe thinking about these things from an artistic perspective is a good first step to thinking about actually making them functional in our daily lives. And one of the first things that will need to be done is kind of mass producing the materials in order to, make them affordable, in order to make them accessible to people. And then once we are actually at that stage, we have to make sure that people actually do really want to do this. So we have to ponder whether there are ethical and moral considerations. So for example, at what point are materials and structures actually alive? Just because they don't have DNA, if they're functioning like cells, does that actually make them cells? And if we have lots of those cells together, does that make them an animal or a plant or something else that we care about in some way? And depending on your answers to that, does this change how you use them or whether you want to use them at all? And what sorts of materials are being made to create all of this stuff? Were they ever part of a living being? Even if the final product is not living, if it was made from something that once was, does that kind of change your attitude towards it? So basically there are all these considerations of whether this is something we should do. And then if we do decide to go ahead with it, we also probably want to be thinking about things like, how do we make sure that all these materials that are kind of living or living-ish don't, become aware suddenly. We don't want to have some sort of, Skynet, Terminator type thing happening where all of our stuff suddenly rebels against us. So there are all these kinds of crazy things to think about. And on top of that, you then also have to think about privacy. So do you want spaces to remember you and have some sort of an imprint of you? Do you want your building to remember and recognize you and then respond to you in some way that's different from how it responds to someone else? Could these materials or spaces ever be influenced by someone else so that you go into your house and then suddenly something happens because someone else is manipulating it? And then also we have to think about things like biohazards. So as decomposition takes place, as chemicals are released and sucked up, as genes flow around in the environment, could things go wrong and become dangerous in some way? And of course, all of this is still quite theoretical because it's a very new field, but these are the sorts of questions that we have to ask. And the next thing that the author talks about in the book is to kind of not ask those questions again and not really pose answers, but to just kind of say, here's a situation where I could see we might use some of this stuff. Can you envision this actually happening, and is this something that you would feel comfortable with? So in a way, it is kind of like taking those questions and putting them into a real-world scenario that is not quite so vague. And the scenario that she describes is Venice. So we all know that Venice is sinking below the sea because it's built on soft ground and the sea level's rising. And also the water and the salt in the water and the other chemicals, all of this stuff is working to erode the materials and create further structural instability. And on top of all of this, there's also heat from the sun that's doing a lot of damage. And so the buildings in Venice are really not doing well. They're quite decayed in many places. And basically there are people that just go around perpetually trying to do damage control and keep everything afloat, kind of literally in this case. So in this type of habitat, you've got a lot of species like algae and shellfish and bacteria that evolved to thrive in this sort of environment and to create little microenvironments in which they can survive. So they kind of alter their own habitat to make it more amenable to them. So they accrete things, they secrete things, they remold things, they sculpt materials that they had obtained from their habitat. And there's potential there for us to emulate these sorts of behaviors and to take advantage of this sort of stuff, and to endow buildings then with these same behaviors so that they could be similarly successful and long-lived. And the idea that the author has here is that we could use protocell technology and also synthetic biology to create an artificial limestone reef that sits underneath Venice and would prevent it then from sinking any further below the waves. So in this case, we would create potentially some light-sensitive photocells that would preferentially target the dark areas, so for example, near the foundations of the buildings, once you've put them into the water. These things could have metabolic activity that would allow the cells to harvest chemicals from the water and then use them to create their own crystalline skins, and you would have a lot of these protocells aggregating, so you'd suddenly have lots and lots of things that are quite hard and quite sturdy grouping together. So this would act as a foundation, not just for the buildings, but also then for native species, so things like barnacles and clams, and all of these could come in and cumulatively then work together to create even more of a foundation. So you would just have to start off with one small amount, and then that would kind of snowball, for lack of a better word, and you would have more and more building up and keeping the buildings in place, providing that foundation so that everything is sturdy from now on. And if you do get all these other natural species in there, you can have them performing other activities that are quite useful as well. So things like carbon dioxide fixation, the absorption of pollution, the increasing of biodiversity, and the kind of general health of the waters. And see, none of that sounds like it's extremely unusual or weird or uncomfortable. All of that sounds like something that's actually quite palatable and quite a good idea. So there maybe is a spectrum along which we can handle some of these crazy ideas, and then after a while it's maybe ethically or morally uncomfortable. But certainly it seems like for cases like this, it could be a really useful thing to kind of use these materials and see what they could do in our habitats. Welcome back to The Wild Side. I'm your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Patty Lovelace with Working on a Building. And this is the final portion of today's show, which is all about living architecture, an idea proposed by Rachel Armstrong in a TED Talk and also in a TED-sponsored book. And just before the break, I was talking about a potential scenario in which you might create a structure with living materials that could then help the city of Venice. And the last point that I want to talk about from the author is the idea of creating not just a particular or singular structure, but actually an entire city. And so her idea here is that you can scale up this approach and use it not just to create one single thing, one building, one reef, one retaining wall that might address a single problem, but actually to overhaul and reclaim entire communities and make them more a part of the environment, to make them maybe cheaper, more accessible to more people, to make them greener, to make them fit in better, to do all sorts of different things that we want to do in a sustainable world. And one of the nice things she says here is that we wouldn't necessarily need to knock down old neighborhoods and start again, but could potentially reclaim buildings that are already there. So for example, we could strip stuff down, so we just take off the outer walls and leave kind of the frame on the inside, and then build on the outside only, so adding in those skins or painting on layers of these chemicals to basically replace the stuff that was there on the outside, but keeping that inner bit the same. And this certainly would be less expensive, and it wouldn't necessarily require people to relocate during the renovation, so it's a lot more easy to do in some ways. And it could create facilities that are a lot more green, which is currently a very big selling point, and it has really high economic value. So even though it might cost up front, it actually might be an investment over the long term. And one of the goals of this sort of overhaul would be to improve the sustainability and increase ecological connectedness. So, for example, to produce something that's better for carbon consumption, to create fewer pollutants that are introduced into the environment, to place less pressure on the habitat during construction or maintenance, and also potentially to make it easier to make land use decisions. So we might be able to make cities more fertile, for example, by incorporating more buildings and more living materials. We also could facilitate the reuse and recycling of certain materials rather than having these things that we knock down and have tons and tons of cinder blocks and steel and all sorts of chemical stuff that's left over in the rubble. We could have things that do biodegrade and take up much less space and vanish much more quickly, and so it's easier to kind of cycle through the old stuff and the new stuff. We might be able to allow humans to see and experience and remain connected to natural processes better, and therefore have a better understanding of wildlife and of ecosystems. And all of that actually is quite good also for mental health and physical health, so it could have benefits to individuals as well. And most importantly is the idea that this could provide some resilience for natural disasters and for other unexpected events associated with, for example, climate change, and also to allow the buildings to work with the natural ecosystem in order to achieve particular services that we like to take advantage of. So it would be really great if we could create buildings that would do things like provide clean water and create heat for free. So all this stuff that we pay for right now as additional utilities, we could maybe build right into our buildings and have them do it for us. So I began this whole thing with the case study of Japan and what happened when the tsunami hit Japan. And the author comes back to it at the end of her book as well, and kind of describes some of the things that she envisions this technology could ultimately do in a place like Japan. So, for example, she suggests that you could have a retention wall founded on protocells that would exist out in the bay in order to protect the shoreline. You could apply coatings that would help walls withstand earthquakes, but also support plant growth, giving the city fresher and cleaner air. You could grow things like emergency bubbles that would provide nutrition and food to people who are injured in such a thing. So if you see the flood coming, you can get into the pod and it would give you the air and the water and the food that you need while you're inside, and then kind of float on the water until someone can come rescue you. You might even be able to create everything on top of bioscaffolding that immediately starts to grow back after a flood or an earthquake or a fire. So once everything has been demolished, this stuff could already just by itself start sprouting up again in order to help you replace the buildings and kind of restart the growth of crops and do whatever it is you need to do to pick things out of the rubble and start again. So I know that a lot of that sounds, like something that's very extremely far off, because it involves a lot of technology. It involves stuff that we haven't quite done yet, or at least we haven't done it on a very large scale, and it involves quite a radical shift in thinking. And so that makes you ask, is it really possible? And if it is possible, when are these techniques going to come online? Is this going to happen within our lifetimes or some really long and distant point in the future? But what's amazing is that actually some of these ideas are not incredibly dissimilar to some of the advances we are seeing right now in medicine. So for example, we do grow replacement organs and skin and all sorts of structures in a laboratory. We do take artificial things and insert them into people. And so actually some of this stuff isn't necessarily as far off as we think. It's just not extremely common just yet, but we might be getting there. So it's a really intriguing idea, and it's certainly worth thinking about whether this is a thing you can imagine happening in your lifetime and in your habitat, and maybe even in your own house. And if you're interested in reading more about this, I will post the link to the book on the Wildside webpage, and I'll also post the link to the author's original TED Talk. But for now, thanks very much for listening, and I will leave you in the hands of Kate Bush singing An Architect's Dream.